We are going to start off with a request for any bill introductions. Any bill introductions? Seeing none, we're going to transition right to our presentation on teacher licensure. So we have with us Shane Carter. Shane, your name, I'm sure your ears were burning a week and 2 weeks ago because you were mentioned repeatedly in a couple hearings. And so here you are to talk to us about teacher licensure. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair.
And you need to turn on your mic.
I'm already starting off well. Okay.
You are.
Well, good afternoon, Madam Chair, and thank you all for the opportunity to speak about teacher licensure today. So go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, that works. So this will be the topics that I'll be providing an update on. We'll go through an apprenticeship program review. Then we'll discuss American Sign Language, some assignment information and requirements that deal with American Sign Language. Then we'll move on to the definition of non-licensure, and then follow that up with some educator licensure numbers and breakdowns. So as we go into the education or the apprenticeship review, I want to start with giving you some background. So the next couple of slides are going to be more informational background about how the apprenticeship started and what it actually is. So first of all, at its core, a registered apprenticeship program, it's a way to create a grow your own teacher preparation program. And also provides access to federal dollars to create and pay for that training for educators to get into the field. So as with any federal program, there are specific criteria that need to be met in order to qualify for that funding or to qualify for that program. So in Kansas, there is an additional step. Some states can apply directly to the Department of Labor to become a federally registered apprenticeship program. In Kansas, we apply to the Department of Commerce and then also have to get approved through the Governor's Council on Apprenticeships. Now, on the right-hand side, there's a list of what an apprenticeship is not. So it's not a replacement of teacher education preparation through colleges and universities. So even if we participate in these programs, our higher ed partners will be involved in this process, and there's still a requirement and a need to complete that teacher education preparation program through those universities. And it's also not the silver bullet to take care of all educator shortage issues. It's a very smart individual said it's another arrow in our quiver to get after that shortage. So I kind of use that analogy as well. So there can be, if it's implemented correctly, there can be some improvement in our shortage numbers. So where did it begin? See, it's already breaking down on me. Uh-oh. Okay, so Tennessee was the first state, Tennessee Department of Ed. They applied many years ago with the Department of Labor for a grant to start. You wait on? Yes, it's working. Hey, it's my day. All right. So the Tennessee Department of Education applied with the Department of Labor for a grant to create and have education or teaching represented as a federally registered apprenticeship program. It took many years, like 8 years, to finally get approved. In January of 2022, it was finally approved, and other states could start applying for apprenticeships. Tennessee was the first state to start that, and this was Tennessee's kind of grow your own program that was created. Kansas, prior to the registered apprenticeships being approved, we actually started grow your own programs back around the 2017-2018 school year. These are our limited license programs. They're geared towards two of our high-end needed areas, elementary education and then special education. So these programs, they don't meet the requirements of a federally registered program, but you'll hear the term apprenticeship, and at the end of the day, some of the issues that we've had with communication is we already have these programs and people think that they are registered apprenticeship programs, and they're not. So we have had success with those programs, and that also is another issue that, we already have these programs in place. How do we adjust, or do we need to adjust those to meet these federally registered requirements? All right, so on the left-hand side, these are the federal criteria. I labeled it federal, but in Kansas, once again, we get approved through the Department of Commerce, so it would still go through our Department of Commerce. But there's a requirement for structured on-the-job training, which is annually 2,000 hours. There's job-related education that has to be completed. For us in Kansas, there's a bachelor's degree requirement to be a teacher, so that stays intact. So it would have to be a bachelor's or master's level education degree that would be completed. There's wage progression that's included, as well as having a mentorship assigned, and at the end of the day, there has to be a valued credential or a nationally recognized credential that's issued. So if we break this down to Kansas's programs that are offered now, our limited apprentice programs, they're not approved by the Department of Commerce. There's not an actual structured layout of on-the-job training or learning that has to be done. It's done through our higher education standards, program standards for that particular area. So there's not an actual requirement for those hours to be tracked. Job-related education, already stated, bachelor's or master's are required when you complete that program. There's not specific wage progression because individuals that participate in this program, they're licensed and they could be a teacher of record when they start, so they're drawing a salary, a contracted teacher salary. There is a mentorship requirement, and they are issued a valued credential, which is that teaching license. Now, as far as our Apprenticeship Way Forward, we do have a working group that's created with our higher ed partners, our district partners, and other education professional agencies that are participating in this, and we're working through developing a plan to send to our state board to review and possibly approve to implement an actual registered apprenticeship program. So I will take a pause and see if there's any questions about apprenticeships.
We're going to start with Senator Petty.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, Shane, back on the slide, the comparison between the federal and the Kansas limited, and on the, I know that under the federal criteria, it has that wage progression, and you're saying in Kansas, there's not a wage progression because you already have to have a bachelor's or a master's, but when I'm looking at the federal criteria, isn't there's a bachelor's or a master's as well?
No, so there just has to be some type of education requirement, not necessarily a bachelor's or master's degree. So whatever that particular industry requires, that's what it relates to. So the way apprenticeships are set up, it's some of those other industries that are out there. So it may not actually be a bachelor's or master's, but from our view, we would still, Kansas, if it was going through the federal program, there would still be a requirement for that bachelor's degree or master's degree.
So you have an in parentheses there because in Kansas, under the apprenticeship program, that still would be
a licensure requirement because it's required to qualify for a teaching license in Kansas to hold a bachelor's degree.
And that meets the federal criteria.
By default, it meets the requirement of the feds to have education related to that job field. Okay. And then for the wage progression, I'll go ahead and clarify that too, Senator. So for the registered programs, an individual wouldn't come in as a teacher of record. They would have to start at some salary. Like for instance, Tennessee started them as assistant teachers at like $15 an hour. I think it was actually 17, but and each year that they progressed in the program, they would have to receive a raise, whether it's a quarter, 50 cents or whatnot, each time they progress through the program through a semester. And then for our limited apprentice licenses, the reason that doesn't apply is because these individuals come out as contracted teachers while they hold that license. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Senator Sykes and then Senator O'Shea.
Thank you. Thank you for being here, Shane. My question is, and I don't know if Tennessee does this or others, is there a way that you can kind of merge like an apprenticeship with, and now I just lost, with kind of that last semester where teachers or students are in the classroom, but they're not getting paid and they're getting that hands-on experience, but to do maybe a longer student teaching, that was my word, but doing more of an apprenticeship, maybe a year to get more hands-on. Does anyone do that?
Yeah, so kind of the premise of this actual program, so a typical apprenticeship program would be 3 years long. You would create opportunities throughout that 3 years where that individual would be experiencing student teaching. It actually gives them more time and opportunity in the classroom to work on that instruction. So that actual student teaching requirement, it's removed if they're completing that apprenticeship piece because they're doing it over a 3-year period. So they have more opportunity in the classroom.
Senator O'Shea.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm feeling a little bit confused. Okay. So it's somewhat similar to what's been talked about, but if they already have to get the bachelor's essentially, why would they get an apprenticeship if they're, like, it's not coming, it doesn't sound like it comes alongside, it sounds like it's another thing to do on top of that. So what's the purpose?
Well, it's simultaneous, so it gets individuals first for that grow your own piece. You have a pair in your school district, you're trying to get them in the classroom. It allows for them to have their education paid for, basically through, federal dollars, implying that we could implement to get that paid for. And instead of going through the traditional experience of completing classroom training and then entering the school for, partial semesters, that individuals in the classroom working as a teacher assistant or para as they're finishing this program, and they have a guaranteed wage that they're collecting as they go as well. So they're getting paid and their education get paid for. And more importantly, they're getting experience in the classroom and learning more about the profession by being there every day.
Senator Dietrich.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for that explanation, because I was a little confused as well. So one question about the licensure piece, the grow your own concept, having the paraprofessional or the student teacher, or the student, I want to call it student, just that training piece, the apprenticeship piece. So do they then have to pass a praxis at the end of that?
Yes, so Kansas teacher licensure requirements would still be in effect. An individual would have to pass, which currently requires passing a pedagogy assessment, the PLT, and then a content assessment, the praxis content knowledge exam, as well as earning that degree and having a background check and submitting an application and fee. So the teacher licensure requirements don't change.
So in the apprenticeship model that we're looking at, when would they get that information, the pedagogy piece that would allow them to pass the praxis if they're not in a classroom taking courses?
Yeah, so if they're to participate in the actual apprenticeship, there's a college credit requirement that they have to complete simultaneously as they're doing it. So they're getting that as they go, and it's a requirement. If they decide to drop out of that at any point, then they have to drop out of they would be required to drop out of the apprenticeship program as well.
Thank you, thank you.
Senator Erickson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was just curious, and thank you, Shane, for being here today. In the comparison between the federal and the Kansas Limited, have you studied to see if there's any discrepancy in the outcomes in terms of teacher competence or preparation with the differences between those two, or have you examined that?
No, to be honest with, it's so new, there's not data there that we could actually do that comparison. With our limited apprentice licenses, we have a few years of data, but the teacher apprenticeship piece, it's basically just started in Tennessee. It's the only one that we could really refer back to as far as finding that information, and it's very limited data set. So I don't think there's much that we could infer at this time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Petty.
I'm just an FYI, this would help me for understanding it. So when it seems to me that in looking at this, if that you could have student A, and under the federal criteria, this is what their process, what could look like, and then student B, if they're under the Kansas Limited Apprenticeship Program, because as I'm listening to my own questions and those of my colleagues, it is a little confusing as to, do they have to have the bachelor's before they actually go into the apprenticeship program? Are they getting it while they're in it? You just said, you made the comment just this, in the last response to Senator Erickson about dual track, doing simultaneously. So I'm just saying, for my understanding, it certainly would help me to.
Okay, sure. And Senator Petty, I'll try to do a better explanation as well. So I'll break it down. So the apprenticeship program, the registered one, when you create the program, it's scalable. You can adjust it. So, at some point we could start, it could only be individuals that already hold a bachelor's degree, but then it could be added on, or it could be individuals that are just entering that college experience. It's just building the program and then having that structured and laid out. So there's options within it. As far as the federally registered program versus the Kansas Limited tracks, a district and an individual would have to make the decision. Do I want to be a teacher of record, a teacher of contract when I complete a program and go into the classroom, or do I want to apply and have my education paid for and then go on a slower track and pick up pedagogy and content training as I go along through the apprenticeship program. So it boils down at the end of the day of those two items. Does an individual want to start as a teacher of record or start as an apprentice?
Senator Gossage.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll be very quick. I'm a bit confused, as are my colleagues, obviously, and I guess we're addressing this as part of a teacher shortage. Is that what you're saying? And so I know that they made some adjustments to who could be a substitute, for example. I remember years ago, you had to be actually a certified teacher to be a substitute teacher. We made some adjustments to that. So I'm trying to understand why one would want to be an apprentice if they could be a full teacher, unless it would be, for example, someone who has a bachelor's degree or a master's degree in chemistry, and they would be willing to teach, and they don't have all of the teacher's credentials. But I know that we make some accommodations for that currently, where one could be in the process of getting their teacher credentials and still teach, especially in the inner city. So explain how the apprenticeship is supposed to help with that shortage.
So think of it as another option. Number one, not everyone, if they're coming in, switching careers, maybe they're not ready to take over a classroom. Until you've experienced what it's like to deal with classroom management and be in that environment, you may not know what you know. So this apprenticeship program will be available for someone who's not ready to jump in there and be that teacher of record. They want to get more contact hours in the school and kind of learn more about the profession before taking on that teacher of record role. So that's who we would kind of lead into this apprenticeship program. And plus, depending on different financial backgrounds, if they're enrolled in these limited apprentice programs, in many cases they're paying out of pocket for tuition, there may not be funds there where they can pay for that. So the apprenticeship program, they can qualify for additional funds that may allow them to actually get into the field, whereas if they didn't have this available for them, they couldn't pay for their college and they couldn't get training. So they may end up staying as a para whenever they actually desire to, move into being that teacher of record one day.
I do have a follow-up question. It was brought to my attention. You could have a master's degree and be teaching at a community college or a technical college, perhaps part-time, but teaching for some time. It could be in English, it could be in math, but you would have to go through an apprenticeship program to teach K through 12?
No, you wouldn't have to do it. This is just another option. So we also have what's called a restricted teaching program that's been around for years, since around 2009, and that's geared towards individuals that have a degree in a content area like math or science, and they're going to teach at the secondary level, grade 6 to 12. That program, that's where we would lead them to. This could be an option, but I don't think that would be their best option.
No, it wouldn't. Okay, thank you. Other questions? Let's keep going.
Okay. Well, maybe. All right, so the next topic I was going to speak on were there questions about American Sign Language. So the data on this slide is the breakdown of assignments and class counts associated with American Sign Language during the 2021-2022 school year. So when you read down the totals, of all the districts, 23 assignments were reported for American Sign Language with a total class count of 60. So to put this into perspective, in the school year, there were over 117,000 assignments that were reported, and 23 of those assignments are American Sign Language. Of individuals or districts that reported American Sign Language courses, there are 10 of them versus, the number of districts we have. But I just wanted to put this in here for perspective since there were questions about those assignments, and it's just purely for some background. And I think on the next slide, we get to the information or questions that you had. I kind of touched on it a little bit. So there's a total of 16 educators in the state of Kansas that were reported as teaching American Sign Language courses in those 10 districts that I mentioned earlier. And those licensure requirements for those individuals are to hold a standard license at the grade level. So when we use the term standard, it's usually a professional license or an initial teaching license, and they had to hold that at the grade level. There wasn't any additional requirement for having an American Sign Language endorsement because we don't offer one. It doesn't exist in our regulations. So through the ASL task force, we started meeting with them. We took their information to the Professional Standards Advisory Board, And the Professional Standards Advisory Board did recommend the creation of an American Sign Language teaching endorsement. And as far as the future work that's involved with that, that will eventually get to the State Board of Education as a regulation update for their review and approval.
So on that issue, with the 10 districts and the 23 assignments and the 60 students, how many of those are high school students that are taking it for a foreign language credit?
Yeah, so a majority of those that are at the secondary level, that's what it is. It's it's for an elective for world language, essentially. So it's open to anybody. I don't have the exact numbers for the assignment piece for students, but anything that's offered at that secondary level that's with our districts that's basically what it's there for.
So if a school district were offering Spanish or German or French, right now, the foreign language teacher would be required to have an endorsement in that area?
That is a true statement, yes. So they would have to they would be required to hold that Spanish endorsement, that German endorsement, whatever the case would be, and the teaching license, obviously.
I do think that the school districts, the 10 districts that are offering those courses, particularly for high school students, thinking that they're earning foreign language experience, I think that parents should be informed that those instructors do not have the endorsements to be teaching that foreign language. The expectation if a child is taking Spanish or French, a more traditional foreign language course, is that that individual can speak that with a level of fluency, and not having an endorsement brings that to question. I appreciate the update on that.
Yes, ma'am.
So now on to the next.
All right, so there was a question about what consists or constitutes non-licensure. So there's a couple of different things that we look at for what we would classify as non-licensure. One, does the individual hold a license? Have they applied for a license? And if they're teaching, they should hold a license. If not, they're considered non-licensed. Or if an individual has held a license, expired, and they didn't meet renewal requirements to reinstate that license or apply for another. We also have what's called licensed unqualified. So that'll be an individual that holds a professional license that's teaching math, but they're endorsed for English language arts. So we would also consider that. They're not licensed appropriately at that grade level. So we would consider that non-licensure.
I'm not, oh, Senator Dietrich.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is just a terminology question. I've been retired several years, so is unqualified the same as not highly qualified?
So in 2017, with No Child Left Behind being repealed, we did away with with the term highly qualified. That's been replaced with licensed at the level. So if an individual is appropriately licensed, they hold that endorsement at that grade level. So this license unqualified would basically be the old case of not highly qualified because they don't hold that endorsement.
Same thing, just different terminology.
There you go. Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Right, and finally, there was a question about how many licensed teachers we have. I wanted to provide this additional data as well first. So this was the school year 21-22 assignment data, how many educators were reported. So if you're looking at the assignment type for our elementary preschool teachers, there was a total of 16,333 individuals that were reported as having those assignments. As far as actual individuals that hold teaching license with endorsements that are comparable to that particular assignment, we're setting just under 20,000. If we move on down to the SPED licenses, I think there was another question that was asked. There were right under 5,000 assignments that were reported, and we currently have 8,500 individuals that are licensed for special education, different categories. There are subcategories to special education, but two of our biggest are our high incidence special education and low incidence. And then also for leadership, so right around 3,000 individuals were reported with leadership assignments. And as far as licenses, individuals that hold either district or building leadership, we're setting at about 6,000. Now, I would throw out two for those numbers. If you're simply going to add them up at the end, it's going to be misleading because an individual can serve in multiple areas. For instance, you could have an individual that's teaching middle level math, secondary math, and also covering a CTE course. So they're in three categories. At the end of the day, our total license number ended up being approximately 44,000 as far as individuals that were reported in the classroom.
Senator Petty.
So this just reflects the responsibilities that they have in their teaching capacity in 21, 22.
That's correct. So it's that assignment that they were reported teaching or what role they were serving in during that school year, yes.
Could have a teacher that has multiple certifications, but they might not be using them in that they're teaching assignments or assignments that year. So this is what they're doing.
Yes. So, and the reason I wanted to provide that is because I think the question was actually asked, how many people are licensed? And this kind of adds context to that number, because I can give you a number of 20,000 people that are licensed for elementary K to 6, but this puts some context to it. And, it also shows that, we do have educators out there that have endorsements, but, they may not be serving in that capacity.
Madam Chair, can I just jump back a little bit on the unqualified? Okay, so it's just the slide before. I'm just curious. I mean, there's this big push. I mean, I was teaching then for under Leave No Child Behind that everybody had to be highly qualified to be in their position. And so there were actually people that were displaced because they were K-9 certified and they might have been teaching PE for 10 years. But so I'm just curious. So now, it would seem that we wouldn't have too many people falling into that licensed unqualified category as we did have, starting with Leave No Child Behind. So,
yeah, so our numbers have remained pretty steady on that. It's somewhere around 94% are license qualified. The requirement of No Child Left Behind was 95%, and we've kind of maintained close to that over the last 5-6 years.
So what do you usually see the reason why they are licensed unqualified?
Yeah, so like one of our more common instances is an individual that's licensed elementary K to 6, and they move into a middle school level position. In Kansas, you can add a middle school endorsement by passing a content exam and adding that to your license. So in many cases, it's individuals that just haven't passed that exam. They're in the process of doing that, and then they'll add the endorsement and be qualified.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
I believe, do you have another slide, or is that it?
That was it. I hope that was everything you needed, Madam Chair.
Well, we're going to call on a few. We'll start with Senator Erickson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just real quick, Shane, Senator Petty caught one of my questions. But do you track how many teachers request to have an endorsement removed from their license?
Yes. So there's a formal process they do it. Do I have a roll-up where I'm tracking that? No, but can I pull the data? Yes. So there's a formal process they have to submit to our office to do that. It's not a standard report that we pull, but I have access to those numbers.
I think that would be interesting to know. I just know, from my experience that frankly, when we were short teaching in a certain area, if a teacher was teaching a subject or grade level that they loved, but the district could assign them to teach whatever they needed, they would pull their endorsement out of that area so they wouldn't be transferred. So I'm just curious how many teachers do that.
Yeah, it's really not that common. I've probably in a year processed maybe 5 or 6, so it's not a huge amount.
Very common. Okay.
No, ma'am.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Committee, any final questions? I appreciate your thoroughness. I think that not only did your presentation address the many issues that we were concerned about, but you were able to, I know there was a little concern about all the questions. Those are great. I think there is still a desire, if we could have really kind of a timeline of example, student A, if they were to follow a federal process, and perhaps give us 2 scenarios if they're Kansas students and they would follow the process that we have available here. Maybe one where they already have an underlying, perhaps a science degree or something, like a bachelor's degree, and someone that perhaps just has a little bit of higher ed.
Yes, okay, Madam Chair, I'll take that as a due out, and then we can lay out some of those other licensure options that are available that weren't covered in this as well, so that would,
And it's more than fine if you email that to our committee assistant, Cindy.
Okay.
And then when that's available, hopefully sometime next week, we'll make sure that the committee is aware.
yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much. We appreciate your presentation, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you for your time, Madam Chair.
Next up, we have a presentation from Dr. Blake Flanders. He's the president and CEO of the Kansas Board of Regents, and he's going to talk to us about the public universities' teacher preparation programs. So welcome today.
Hey, thank you, Chair Baumgartner and members of the committee. I would loosely call this a presentation. It's just, I'm happy to be here just to provide you the data that we have on teacher preparation programs, but I do not have a PowerPoint today. I just have these spreadsheets. You'll notice that all of our public universities, it's just on the public universities, not on the independent universities, but on the public universities, each public university has a teacher preparation program. I think that probably that relates back to that many teachers go to work locally, and that areas of the state, those programs are needed where the schools are located. We received a legislative request for 10 years of student enrollment and graduation rates for teacher preparation programs with data separated where we could into elementary and secondary programs. We have the data from the universities on enrollments, completions, and graduation rates, which we have provided. As you can see, we have a summary sheet as well. The numbers in terms of enrollments have softened a little, but have essentially remained relatively flat. There is a decline in academic year 2015, and that is due to definitions that refine to exclude freshmen and sophomore in the lower division pre-teaching programs. So those were taken out. You'll see that across the board, that those numbers, it's a bit artificial, but show a decline. And then, so you'd really, it's more valuable to track from that year forward. In terms of completion, we've had just a very slight increase in the near term in the amount of completion, probably due to a larger percentage of the students completing. But candidly, I think we probably wouldn't expect that increase to continue. If your enrollments soften, it's generally an issue of it softens the completions 3 or 4 years from that time. I'd be happy to stand for any questions that you would have.
Committee, do you have questions? Have all of you accessed the data? Okay. So one of the things I notice, you know, when I'm looking, just flipping to you, the page that has Fort Hays State University, their numbers are actually going up as far as student count for completions. So I see that they are up to 303, which is the highest that they've had this last year. That's the highest they've had since 2013. I see in other areas, though, that enrollment, you know, it's interesting because the deans have come together with a proposal that I know that they're asking. It's interesting, they're asking, I believe, the State Board of Education, or they're asking K-Board to be looking at that. But when I read the coverage on that, it was as if the deans that are listed on the cover page had just realized that they had a decline in enrollment. And that's surprising to me in the context, you know, when I look at K-State, 10 years ago they had over 1,600 students in combined elementary and secondary, and it has been down, down, down. It's at 1,100 now. So we have, you know, almost a 35% decline. And you kind of, as you go through, you see that. And yet, one of the things that we do see is we look at 13 years ago, Wichita State had 828 students. Last year, they had 1,222. And so they are, in an incremental way, they are 33% up. And it just is a little confounding to me that they're only now, as deans, coming forward saying, gee, we need to kind of look at doing things differently. When I looked at the University of Kansas, I thought that was interesting because they are very flat. And from the 2013 to the 2022, and yet they had grown some in 2016, 2017. And, some of those time periods were back when it was a 5-year program rather than a 4-year program, as if you were getting a master's in engineering or something. It was ironic that it would be a 5-year program. So talk to us a little bit. It's interesting because one of their proposals is that school districts pay 2/3 of a salary, essentially, for student teaching, and that the state pay the additional third for a salary for student teaching, which means 100% would be paid by the state, because the money for the school is coming from the state. So it's interesting to me that that was their approach, as opposed to not requiring students to pay tuition for their student teaching, because when a student teaches, they're earning college credit, and it's requirement of graduation. But they pay tuition for that student teaching semester or semesters. So talk to us a little bit about that recommendation and where you see it going with the Board of Regents. I know you can't, you don't have a crystal ball as far as what your Regents members might say, but talk to us a little bit about why it is it's taken 10 years for the deans to come together, and now they're turning to the state, gee, we have this shortage, help us find a solution. Where were they 5 years ago? Where were they 3 years ago? Where have they been every year? And I could honestly say it isn't just in the Department of Education or the School of Education where enrollment is declining. Wichita State is going to be the one university that across the board has an increase of enrollment. So talk to us about what it is that the universities are going to do different to try and change, other than pay students to student teach. That's after 4 years. And some of the data that you did share with us, and I appreciate it, that the percentage of students that complete within the 4 years, and it's low. For most every university, it's under 50%. So it's not that last year of student teaching that's keeping students from completing. Talk to us about where you see this going and why now?
Sure, I can just tell you a little bit about our process. I can't tell you where the deans were 10 years ago, but I can tell you where we are now. So the board at the retreat and the board's goals were to look at a couple of workforce areas. Granted, there are a number of shortages right now. So if you select a career path, you can find shortages all across this economy. We selected 2. We said, let's look at the teacher shortage and let's look at our healthcare. So with the teachers, what we did is we asked the deans to come together and have an educator task force and develop some recommendations for the board. They did that relatively quickly. I appreciated their work on that. They've presented that to the board. The board accepted that report, and here's where we are now. The board has tasked me with prioritizing those recommendations. So I'll be going through each of those recommendations, there are several, and saying, which ones do I think we should start with? Which ones are longer-term recommendations? And I think in terms of enrollments, I think it's fair to say that, yes, enrollments have been soft, and that trend's continued. We've had, on Thursday, I'm going to, I think it's Thursday of this week, I'm back. I'll be walking through the Educator Task Force report with you then. But I think it's fair to say that there's been a softening in enrollments. I see a couple of reasons for that. Number one, our college going rate has dropped, goes down about 1 percentage point a year. It has in the last 7 years. And so it's just the number of students accessing, and this isn't just college, liberal arts college, baccalaureate. This could be a welding program. This could be going to a technical education college. This could be going to a community college. We're dropping about 1% a year. So we have to get that stopped. And then second, I think some career paths have been more attractive than others. And in some cases, if incumbents in the field are not, if the career is taken a turn, gotten harder, perhaps not as enjoyable as it once was, that filters out into people who are pursuing that degree area. And so that those kinds of things would, if there's evidence out there that the pay is low, well, students might pursue more robust pay options, perhaps through the College of Business. That can happen, okay? So, and I think what's happened is our population in Kansas has changed and is changing rapidly, in that the populations that are growing are generally first-generation college students. We have higher numbers of minority students. We have higher numbers of students with financial need. We have more first-generation students. And what do I mean by first-generation students? I mean, their parents did not graduate with a college degree. So that they would be first generation. And here's what we've known. Our systems have not served that population as well as we could have. And so we need greater outreach. We have looked at and contracted with the National Institute of Student Success from Georgia that has been successful in this arena to say, what can we do differently? And one thing is it's just a competition thing, okay? So I don't think it's, you know, it really doesn't matter who finances the internships, but in other areas and in other fields, the internships are paid. Teaching, they're not paid. So if you're a first generation student and you need to work another job to go to school, and now you need to do an internship in teaching that's going to take a lot of work hours and doesn't pay, you might not choose that as a profession. So if that's the population that's increasing and we're looking at ways to get more people into the profession, it might be something you suggest that is supported. Now, how that's supported, whether it's through the state support, whether it's through private industry, or how it's done, I think financing is something that everyone can determine. So I'll have more information on Thursday on that, but that's kind of the short form. So the deans did what was asked from the board, provided those recommendations, and that's where we are right now.
Excuse me, when do you see the deans coming before the Board of Regents again? The education deans?
They've come before the board.
Right, when do you see them coming before you again, or do you?
We might have them come back if there's some nuance, but they've given the report. I don't really see them coming back in front of the board. I'm going to prioritize those recommendations. It doesn't mean that the board and myself won't continue to work with them. I don't know if they'll formally come back in front of the board.
The only reason I asked that is we did have a presentation, I believe it was last week, where we had the education commissioner, actually it was 2 weeks ago, where the education commissioner was here. And part of what he shared, it was a hearing about how the ESSER funds were spent. And he indicated that $15 million had gone toward closing the gap as far as learning loss, and that the 15 million was being used to train over, I believe it was over 2,300 K through third grade teachers on the science of reading and letters. It also indicated that a portion of that he's unclear what that amount is and is supposed to get back to us, but a portion of that is being expended on training college and university professors on how to teach the science of reading and letters. And quite honestly, I think it was like 62 or 64 college professors are receiving this training. And it was appalling to me that K through 12 ESSER money was being used to train individuals that are our professors, that are teaching our college students to be elementary teachers. And it took the funding from a pandemic for them to get that continuing education. In any other school within a university, I think of the IT professors. I think of any type of technology professor. When we're talking about career and tech education, they are required to stay on top of changes that are made available in technology. For us to have professors in our education schools that haven't taken the time to be up to, the science of reading and letters has been around for 15 years and has been considered best practice for nearly that time. And only now are they obtaining that education, which means they're not ready to teach that properly in their classroom yet. So I would, if you would work with the education, or with our K through 12 education commissioner, I would like a listing of the professors and which universities they represent that didn't take this on. As you know, a couple of years ago, this committee tried to move forward that there would be a $30,000 stipend for any of the universities where their Department of Ed folks took the initiative to get that training before the deadline. And their response was, you can't make us do that. You're right, we can't make you do it. But what it does mean is they essentially have committed what I would refer to as education malpractice by teaching something that isn't the appropriate pedagogy for here and now, and to represent the needs of our kids that have either been identified as dyslexic or having other cognitive reading issues. So if you would hunt that down, we still have not yet received that information. I think it's pretty crucial. Because essentially we have to go back and retrain all of those teachers that just graduated because they didn't learn the proper skills. And Kansas kids deserve better.
So the question.
I'm not holding you accountable. I'm just asking, can you work to get that information?
The question is who received training in the specific letters?
They're still receiving. It's a 2-year curriculum. They just started that, so they've got about another year and a half to go.
So I guess that's the question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, Senator Sykes.
Thank you. Thank you. As I look at this chart for the students enrolled and those who receive their graduation in 4 years, do you have those that did not complete? Like, how many are we losing, or how many complete within the 5th year? And I'm thinking back when I was in college, we had a very intense education program at the school I graduated, and people were, they thought it was a 5-year program. But is there a way to get that to those students who started on this path and then they didn't finish, but those that completed within 5 or 6 years?
We can get that. We should have some percentages in there that but we could get we can actually we'll do the math and get you the actual number. That'd probably be more valuable.
Well, if I see, because I see that, like in 2018, 34% of that cohort graduated within 4 years. But I'm saying, how much of that cohort actually attained the degree? Whether it was 4 years, 5 years, 6 years. Do you have that?
Yes. Yes, we can get that information.
Yes, it is Emporia
We
State.
can get that information.
Thank you.
Senator Petty.
Thank you. Kind of along that same line, but I'm looking at the last table, which is the one, student completion of programs which led to teacher certification. I found it rather interesting that actually from 2013 to 2022, there's not a big change.
No.
Of the number of students that have completed. And I'm not sure this table corresponds to whether they're a 4-year or a 5-year, with the length of time that took them. It said except it takes out the freshman and sophomore. So I just found that rather interesting because when I looked at the table about, for example, up above, it looks like, Wichita State they've increased their program, but the completion numbers don't really change that much, even if you have more kids in the program.
Yeah, so this information, if I may, is, it's supply side. So I think, the reason we're here is because of the shortages. So what causes that? You can, if you produce a consistent number, sometimes that completely satisfies the needs of that industry, unless you have higher percentages of retirements, and sometimes we have that. If you have incentives for people to retire quickly, and if you have people leaving the profession. And so then you need to adjust your supply side numbers, as you would know, and those have remained relatively flat. I think we've had perhaps the other 3 things happening within the industry, and we're facing then a shortage. Really, a shortage seems like it was always linked geographically or linked to, seems like special education, there seemed to be some shortage. My colleagues would know a lot more about the field. But now it seems that the shortages are, across the state.
Right, and it's much broader.
Much
it's
broader,
elementary.
yeah.
Do you think, or have you ever looked at whether, I think it was in 2016, we did away with due process, whether that had any impact on candidates going into the field of education?
I've just seen some columns written on that. I don't know. I don't know if there's evidence that it seemed like many districts, local boards decided to continue the practice anyway. So I just wouldn't be able to answer that.
Thank you.
I am going to brag on Wichita State again on that last sheet that has that summary. They had teacher education certification report of 230 in 2013, and it jumped up to 372 this last year. That's a significant growth. My question is, we see several years where there are no numbers. So we see that in 18 and 19. Did they just not track if they were resident or non-resident? Or is that when anyone was considered a resident?
I don't know. I'll have to get that
Okay.
information for you.
Okay. Committee, I'm not seeing any other questions. I do appreciate the information that you shared with us. I don't think that this committee, I can't speak for the House committee, but I don't think this committee has seen this much data with regard to our K through 12 teacher education, at least not in the last 8 years that I know of. So I think it's very valuable. I think it's important for us to look at trends. I think everyone needs to probably go down to Sedgwick County and get a nice big gallon of their water, because whatever they're drinking, it's working pretty well.
Yeah, and I would say this is one slice. The independent colleges also have data, and I know that Matt Lindsay can provide that as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Committee, do want to remind you that we'll be having a hearing tomorrow on Senate Bill 82. We're also going to have some information presented to us, data-driven workforce solutions. If you have not thought about any type of amendments that you might want to put together, we are hopefully sometime this week, first part of next week, we will be working the KSHA bill that we had the hearing on. So the one question I do have for our reviser or for legislative research perhaps, I am hearing concerns being expressed by school districts that should we pass that bill, the KSHA bill, that their fees will immediately be raised, that the school fees to be members of KSHA will be raised. And I don't think we received any specific information about how it is that KSHA figures out those fees. So could we please kind of get a history of what has been the ask for fees for the last few years, and if someone would please reach out to KSHA and say that's what we're hearing, find out if any type of email or message officially was sent out to athletic, to superintendents, athletic directors, or principals of high schools with regard to an increase in fees. And I have to tell you, whether it's fact or fiction, the fear-mongering is unacceptable for schools to be put in that position. If you support a change, then we're going to jack up your fees. So if we could track that down, I'd appreciate it. Senator Petty, did you have a question?
I did. I mean, I believe we're talking about Senate Bill 13. And so a question that I have, and is that if there was, this legislation, however, move forward, when there is a contract that's, a long-term contract that's in place, I'd like to know how that impacts that.
Okay, then I guess KSHA needs to provide that, because I don't believe that they did in their testimony. I think they just shared with us that they had a 5-year contract and that it was automatic renewable. Oh, excuse me, 7-year contract, automatic renewable. So if we could get some feedback on what might be a clause for that contract to be severed from KSHA, that would be helpful. We are adjourned.